Okay. So hi, Vin. Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We just have a
Sure.
few questions. And I guess we can start up with the first one, which is how did the era of anti-Vietnam War organizing shape your political goals? And were there any key lessons you learned from this political moment?
Sure. Well, um, you may know that um, uh, I think among my earliest memories of CISPES was being on the subway in New York, probably 81, and seeing a button. I have them. I mean, else, and there was a picture, sort of this of Central America, very kind of yellow and orange, very dramatic and red. El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. And that was, I mean, that was a slogan that was very widespread. So, the Vietnam War, it ended in April of 75. And, I think it depends kind of how old you were. I was born in 1957. So the Vietnam War was very much part of my childhood growing into, becoming more than a child. My parents were opposed to the war, took me to demonstrations. So, if you were just a little bit younger, you might have missed it, right? And if you were older, you'd be worried. I mean, I remember, being my parents discussing with my older brother what would happen if his lottery number came up in the draft and them saying, "You're going to Canada." That was like, it was very present. But also, um, it was very present in the sense, and I was just thinking about this the other day. I mean, from my point of view, it showed that, um, the people can win, you know? I mean, I remember being in Central Park on the day of liberation when Ho Chi Minh City, it was a glorious feeling because I've been going to demonstrations since like 1968 or something. And uh, so there was a strong sense of like, we can do this. I mean, they can do it and we can support them. The solidarity made, I wasn't that familiar with the word, but the notion seemed very real. And also, I mean, the Vietnam anti-war movement was truly massive. I mean, and long lasting. It didn't flare up in a huge way the way Black Lives Matter did after the murder of George Floyd. It steadily grew until outside of maybe the South, I would say. Otherwise, it penetrated almost everywhere. And, dinner table conversations, and because of the draft, because of the enormous loss of life. So it was all there. So the idea that El Salvador was Spanish for Vietnam was like, of course, right. They're trying to do this over. They want to win this time. The US national security establishment. So I think a lot of us were just kind of ready to go. And I came in relatively late. I came into CISPES in July of 82. I was watching it, I was observing, but I wasn't being active. So there's that, the example of successful armed struggle and revolution, and of a large movement. Of course, our movement never remotely became as large as the Viet, but we were well aware that it was very important to the government that they not create the conditions where such a mass movement could, not use troops, not produce U.S. casualties, and so we were sort of primed for the fight, I would say. And the Vietnam syndrome, right, so called, was all over. So when I went to the national office of CISPES, I was recruited in May of 83 because I guess I had, shown some political skills. I had some background from the 70s in things like canvassing, and that other people perhaps did not have. So I was asked to come to DC. I mean, I'd never run a canvas, but I knew how to knock on door. I don't know, you know, uh, to run a national campaign, a canvassing, a door-to-door campaign. We called it the National Neighborhood Protest Against the War in Central America. We were already shifting to all of Central America by 83. And it was our second national campaign. And the thing about CISPES, and maybe you may have read my CISPES pragmatic, successful, whatever, that essay of mine, was that we didn't just stick the word campaign on anything that we did. A campaign was like, it had specific goals, it had a beginning and a middle and an end that you measured, you trained for it. It was a disciplined operation. So that was a canvas campaign. And the focus was going door to door. to put up yards, what we called window signs. They're only about this big. I hope I have someone somewhere. And this, what was on the window sign was the same that would go up on billboards. We put up about 70 billboards. And it was a picture that was not from Vietnam, but basically it was one like a dot print picture. You know what I mean? Where you turn a photo into just dot print kind of, you can see it's from a photo. And it was of men jumping out of a helicopter. It was actually from like a firefighting helicopter thing. But oh, I mean, you put a helicopter men jumping out of it, there isn't the slightest confusion in 1983 anywhere in the United States what that means. It means Vietnam. And what the window signs and the billboard said was no Vietnam War in Central America. So that's the politics that was there available for us, which was, I led canvas trainings all over the country, including the Deep South. We canvassed everywhere. And honestly, I can't, there was no place, as long as we went to the right kind of turf, you have to know what you're doing. You don't go to bougie upper middle class suburbs because they won't open the door. You go to a certain kind of, older used cars, nice stuff on the porch. This is canvas stuff. We always got a strong response. Do you want to have another one of those Vietnam Wars? Nope, nope, absolutely not. So I hope that answers the question. It was a much more hopeful time actually than the present,
Yeah, I
unfortunately.
think what you're saying, like I have done some door-to-door canvassing, and
Hmm?
it feels like it might be a lot different than it was maybe 40 years ago in terms of like no one opens the door.
I
Um,
know. I've gone out. I've done a lot of. I spent 2 months canvassing in my home county in Pennsylvania, a very red county, and it's hard to get people to open the door. Yeah. And this was we were. I mean, we were asking for money. I mean, it was a real canvas. Anyway, so I
yeah,
hope.
yeah, or even answer the phone as well. Sometimes too, trying to like phone bank and things is really, but there's so
Yeah. Yeah.
many scammers. I think that leads people to. It's kind of like almost like some of our
Yeah.
strategies. We need
Yeah.
to
A
like
lot
I
of
don't know change.
the phone banking and canvassing. These were in a certain sense, they were relatively new organizing technologies, People were not completely burned out. Um, you know, so and yet we had them. I mean, we had more technology. Well, I mean, a lot of things had built up since the 60s, I would say, ways of doing things. Okay, so next question, I guess,
Yeah,
up to
yeah, no,
you.
that was great. So yeah, I guess what prompted your decision to create the student organizing position with
Oh,
CISPES, and was there any organized like key organizers that you worked with that helped you develop this position?
sure. Well, so I'd been asked to come to Washington. I was in New York CISPES, a big chapter, and then I was recruited, and I was originally said, well, would you just come to DC for the next 4 or 5, whatever, 5 months to run this campaign? But once I got there, it was sort of clear that I wasn't going to go back. Like, okay, well, what next? And I had been, I was a very old undergraduate. Um, I actually got my BA when I was 25. I love telling students this, like, you can do that. It's okay. You know, um, and I had graduated in January of 83 from Columbia College, Columbia University, the college. Actually, Barack Obama and I were in the same class. We were both transfers. Columbia was full of transfers, but I do not remember him, even though he was politically active. We probably were in some of the same rooms where the student activist groups were and so on. So I was in Barnard Columbia CISPES. We had a campus chapter that I'd helped, well, resuscitate maybe, I don't know. And I just very much believed in it. I believe it just seemed like why don't we do this? This is where the people are who really, you know, our natural constituency. And there were all these the CISPES leadership were really old, like late 20s. That was a joke. You know, there were all these people like hardened activist types, about 27 or so, who were very like suspicious of, well, students are so flaky and then they just graduate. The stuff that basically people have been saying about students, the Democratic Party for sure, forever. Oh, they're flaky and then they graduate. And I'm like, you're missing the point. They're just there, ready to be recruited. And we could, so we had CISPES was actually, I think, in many a very democratic organization. People, I mean, there was plenty of leadership, including from Salvadorans. But we had what we called a sub-regional coordinators national meeting. We had never had a convention yet. That came later, or a Congress in January of 84. And I had completed my campaign, which included then towards the end a national march in DC, November 12th, 83. And I dreamed up this thing, and I went to the subregional coordinators were a part of a state or maybe a whole state. Like we had 6 subregions in California, because it's big, and so on. And there were about 35 or 40 people there, probably majority on staff, but maybe not all. Anyway, and I made a pitch and proposed it, and there was considerable debate. Like, oh, I don't know if it's not, is it worth it? And finally, they were like, okay, well, I guess Van really wants to do this, and you know, I guess we should authorize it. But there was definitely a certain amount of like suspicion, even though they'd all been student activists. So, so that was kind of, I mean, and some people that in sort of top leadership, trying to think. There were real regional differences in CISPES, but that gets into sort of the complex social history of the left. Like New York East Coast is very different than West Coast, but I could go long on that, but probably not right now. And I think actually I got some key support. In fact, I know I did from West Coast. And CISPES had really come out of the Bay Area in many ways, Bay Area, Los Angeles, and was a lot more, from my point of view, less sectarian or narrow-minded and more kind of open and like, yeah, we can like it's a whole, if you ever go to San Francisco or Oakland, the Bay Area, you'll find that the leftists there are much closer to actual politics than they are in, say, New York or Boston. Okay, in my experience. So anyway, so they kind of supported me, like, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's do it. And then, so that's how the position was created. And I'm trying to remember what we did because there was a big takeoff point in January of 85. In 84, I mean, I try, I sort of tried to create student chapters or where I could, encourage people in the city chapters to go and create a student chapter or more than one. Okay. I know we did, and I wish I could remember the details more, that we organized a campaign to force Henry Kissinger off campus because all these places, because he was such a big deal, were inviting him to give commencement speeches. Well, there were a lot of places where he ended up withdrawing. This was a happy, like 3 or 4 places we drove him out. It was really great. Petitioning, like, and there'd been some very impressive commencement protests. I'll give you an example. I think this is back in 81. Alexander Haig was the Secretary of State. And, some of these people things about the church women who were killed in El Salvador that are really morally disgusting. Jean Kirkpatrick, you know about the church women, the American church women killed in December of 80. Yeah, like they were with the guerrillas, and he'd done some of that. These are, so I think he gave the commencement, if memory serves, at Syracuse, and a bunch of our people, they wore white robes and put blood on the robes and stood up like this. Of course, people don't like it when you disrupt their commencement, but sometimes that's what you have to do. So that was a nice thing that we did in 84, but there was probably a bunch of other things that I don't really remember. But the takeoff, to get to it was, I mean, everything we did was keyed to, as we would say, meeting, sometimes we said guaranteeing the needs of the Salvadorans, of the FMLN. And this was a very serious and respectful relationship. What is going on? What's needed now? What's happening? And working. I mean, there were actually, I just saw on my Facebook that one of the people that I met back in July of 82 and still know, Ramon Cardona, it's his birthday today. And I mean, there were these FMLN reps that we got to know extremely well and had excellent relationships with. So towards the end of 84, as a consequence of what we called sort of the Duarte Project, which was positioning this Christian Democrat, Jose Napoleon Duarte, as a democratic leader, democratically elected, and all this stuff. But it created space. And meanwhile, people like Vice President Bush going and telling a room full of Salvadoran officers, you really have to stop, really tone down this death squad thing. This is a problem. So it created space for the reemergence of the mass movement, the popular movement, the unarmed movement that had been driven out of San Salvador and, killed or driven out. And there was space for them to come back, including the students. So Northwest CISPES uh, decided there should be a student delegation and organized it. I didn't organize it. They did, and they called me up and said, we're because we've got six students, all women from I don't know, San Francisco State, Portland State, like that, okay? And we want you to lead it. I was like, well, whoa, okay. And I mean, and I did that January 85, and that was the first CISPES delegation. We got it actually officially, and I'm proud of this piece of the work because I did do this. Oh, right. Oh, we had done a tour. I was helped coordinate a joint tour with the U.S. Student Association, which no longer exists, but was a very important grouping. Because it was the U.S. Student Association was all the student governments, including the state student government association. So it had a lot of, all the student governments and then big like New York, California state. So that was a big ally. And that was a lot of what I did. Now I'm remembering 84 better. I could tell you, but it doesn't matter. So building coalitions with a bunch of national groups, that was a lot of what I did. So I got them to officially sponsor this delegation, but it was a CISPES delegation. So January 85, me and the Salvadorans, the Salvadorans and Ejeus, the Student Association, which had just come out from clandestinity. You know what I mean? Being underground. They had just come out and reclaimed their campus, which was their campus was, well, it maybe somewhat better condition than what's left of the universities in Gaza, somewhat, but there's no universities in Gaza. They've been bombed into smithereens. So the campus had been invaded. We had footage, I remember showing it many times, of the invasion of the University of El Salvador in early in 80, students being shot. You could see them being shot, laying on the ground, and then, you know, and then occupied and destroyed, everything wrecked. So there were just all hollow shells of buildings, but then they got back in right before we came. So this was a huge breakthrough for our student work because it laid the basis for a direct solidarity campaign with Ajeus and the university. And that's what I did for the rest of that year. And then even when I went off to grad school, the US campaign for the University of El Salvador. So that's very much what happened. We found our niche as part of supporting the popular movement, supporting Ajeus, bringing them here, touring them, material aid quite a bit, and sending many delegations, many students going to El Salvador. I think that's a good short version. There was, well, anyway, I could tell you more about what we did, but that would give you an idea. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Actually, I think you went into my next question, which was that if you were able to connect with revolutionaries from the FMLN, but
Well, the thing is, the FMLN, for reasons I never completely understood, they were able to operate very openly in the US. So, and there were several layers. There was the official representatives of the Political Diplomatic Commission of the FMLN, which was headquartered in Mexico City, and other people that I knew. So, well, there's CISPES, and then there's a bunch of, shall we say, allied organizations, SHARE, the Nest Foundation, the the thing that became the Center for Democracy of the Americas. It had several different names, but it's sort of a policy center. We had and then sister cities. There were at least four other groups, and we were all pretty networked together, pretty tightly. And so people in leadership would go to Mexico City to meet with the Political Diplomatic Commission, which was like the Foreign Service, basically, okay, or the State Department. They had a representation, and I remember Francisco Alchol I remember meeting him, but he was operating at the level of like Congress and the State Department. And later I think he became the Foreign Minister of El Salvador later when the FMLN won the elections. And then there was the official representatives and people like my friend Ramon Cardona, Arnoldo Ramos, Salvador Cortez, Jaime Serrano. There were four, five, six of them. And their job was to go and speak. They were always, speaking, and that had a lot to do with building CISPES. And then to meet with us. But it was a very open and clear, direct relationship. And then there was Casa El Salvador Farabundo Martí, which was sort of the grassroots within the diasporic community. So there were a lot of Salvadorans, around. But uh, It was a very direct, and but also in many ways quite formal. I mean, we would meet with them and they would say, this is the analysis. Here is the analysis. Punto, this is what is happening. This militarily, this is what's happening politically inside the country. This is what's happening in US policy. This is what's happening over with Nicaragua. Therefore, our analysis is the following. And what we would ask you to do, consider doing is, because we understood solidarity as meeting the needs that they articulated. Never, under any circumstances, under like so-called, sorry, other forms of solidarity that had been quite familiar in the 70s, not making taking positions about what they should do, not or picking sides. Now, let me say something that you may or not may not know. The FMLN was made up of 5 political military organizations. You know this, right? Our relationships were essentially with one of those, with the FPL, the Fuerzas Populares de Liberación, which was, and the mass organization of that had been the Bloque Popular Revolucionario, which was the largest of the mass organizations, very, very large, before the repression of the late 70s and early 80s. So, I mean, this used to be sort of like, it wasn't no great secret inside CISPES that this is whom we're meeting with. There were FMLN representatives from other organizations. I remember Guadalupe Gonzalez, and she was from the ERP. But most of our direct work was really with the FPL and all of the popular groups that were, shall we say, affiliated with them. So, but it was a very open, respectful, mutual relationship. Does that give you an idea of what you answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I guess maybe we can transition to talk more about like the relationship between activism and the study of history. So what
Oh,
responsibility do historians have in terms of shaping the present? It's kind of a big question, sorry.
no, well, it's a complicated question for me personally. I'll explain why. There can be a lot of problems when historians, scholars, I mean, so they could be sociologists or whatever, I mean, or political scientists, whatever. But people who write about political movements, right, who are themselves veterans of, because they tend to write about the thing they're familiar with and emphasize the importance of the thing that they're familiar with. So when I wrote Where the Boys Are, and then all these other things I wrote about the New Left, quite a lot, like 3 other books, collection of edited articles, my Bedford book, The Movements of the New Left, all this stuff. I was actually pushing back over a long period of time against the history of the New Left that was completely dominated by formerly young white men who had been in SDS. And they wrote the history of the New Left as the history of SDS, as if SDS is all that mattered. Anything I've written, it's sort of clear that I'm saying no. And for me, there were some actual there were serious political issues because they seem to be saying that the New Left equals, to put it bluntly, white people like them. There are all these important black organizations, but that's not the New Left. I'm like, well, wait, you're telling me that SNCC is not the New Left? Hey, what? SNCC's the most important organization. I mean, you can pretty much take an awful lot back to SNCC, right? Which was in fact interracial. So, so that's always been on my mind. Even now, all these years later, as an example of like, be really careful when you write about things you were involved in. Like, try to step back. And I have written a lot about the Central America movement, as you know, right? There's Where the Boys Are, luckily was not. That was way back, a different thing, thank God. But then I have written like 6 or 7 different articles, though they don't, some of them deal with, oh, there's at least 2 I can think off the top of my head. I can send these to you if you want them, that really deal with the 70s with other things that I'd never been involved in. But it's tricky, So, I mean, people who start reading up on the Central America movement also read that book by what's his name? Christopher Smith. And I admit, I gave it a really shitty review, really, because he literally wrote a book. He's a sociologist which is a legitimate discipline, but sometimes trends more towards kind of just do a few interviews and read a few newspaper articles, to be blunt. And I was really shocked that he would write something about the Central America movement and say right up at the get-go, but I'm not going to talk about CISPES at all. They're important, but I'm just not going to talk about them. And I was like, what is this? You know, not because it should all be about CISPES. That's a huge mistake. That's sectarian. But you actually, I'm trying to answer your question as best I can. When I wrote about the movement, I tried, but maybe, maybe not successfully. I can't evaluate. Someone else would have to come along and read everything that everybody's written and do their own research. And they may say, well, actually, Gosse is exaggerated, Van Gosse, the role of CISPES. CISPES is not as important as he's made it out to be. So anyway, or that wouldn't be the only criticism. So it's very tricky, being, and the first thing I ever wrote, which is this article that came out in a collection called The Year Left. And my article's called The North American Front. I don't know if you've seen that one. It's a big article. It came out like in 87. I was utterly and totally immersed when I was in grad school. I was, helping to lead a very, one of the strongest CISPES organizations in New Jersey. And it's a highlight of my life as a political activist. We built something really strong, not me alone, a whole group of this. We got a lot done. We sent a lot of money. We sent a lot of people, to El Salvador. So, I mean, I was writing something that was scholarly, very left scholarly, in the middle of the thing I was doing, which is, I'm not sure I would recommend that to someone else, but I did it anyway. I don't know if that's answering your question. But,
No, no, I think that yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I was wondering though if you had any like advice for, maybe younger activists who are interested in history, might not have like this sort of veteran knowledge of movements but want to get involved.
well, I mean, I don't, that's a good question. I mean, find archives. If you can't find one, make one up. A lot of activists have personal papers, you know. I mean, there's things that I wrote simply because I happened to go talk to somebody in an office and they said, "Oh, we're going to throw this out," or "Would you like to go through these files?" Most activists are not thinking about all this stuff. Of course, nowadays, I mean, that's the problem. My advice would be, I mean, so much of what we do is it's not paper in a file. It's a folder on our laptop, right? So that's also I don't even know where to start with that. But um, oral history is really valuable, but cannot cannot substitute for the documents. Now that sounds like the most standard conservative advice you could ever hear, but I actually think it's true, you know. So uh, I mean, I'm be careful of oral history actually would be some like it's important, but remember that what people remember is what they've remembered to remember. I mean, these sort of cliches about oral history, you've got to be really careful. I don't mean don't do it. um Try to get your hands on, say, did you keep any stuff? Well, yeah, I got a box up in the attic. You actually want it? You want it? I'll give it to you. I'm not kidding, you know, especially about sort of lefty activist stuff. um I mean, there's the three or four or five main archives that, the Swarthmore College Peace Collection, State Historical Society of Wisconsin, Tamiment at NYU, the Michigan one, whatever it's called, and then the Social Action Collection. Is that it at Berkeley? I mean, but I mean, any professor is going to say, well, there that is over here. Um, okay, I'll give you say one more thing along these lines. And this is a product of the direction that my scholarship went in eventually much later. And, if you look me up or whatever, I ended up writing about Black politics between the Revolution and the Civil War. So actually, younger, people entering into this, I have, I think if you're going to write about activist movements, there is a very strong temptation or tendency to focus on the movements themselves as if what matters is sort of it's a kind of social history, oh, this is what they did and these are their motivations and these are, the movement itself. if I had grad students, which I do not have. I mean, sometimes I get invited to sit on a committee, but unfortunately, I don't have grad students. I wish I was at UMass. Well, I'm retired. I wish I'd been at UMass and not at Franklin and Marshall. That would have been great with all of UMass's great traditions, like African American studies at UMass. I mean, and oh my God, and also um, sort of all those Marxists over there in the economics department. What a great thing. And then there's, Kevin and Chris Appy. I mean, these are really great people. Wow. But anyway, I would say if you're going to look at radical social movements, look at them put them in the context of the actual politics of the time. What did they achieve? You know, uh, so that's just as that, what were they trying to gain and did they get it? In New England, don't study them abstracted from the political context. So I'm going to give you an example in Western Mass, right? Because that's your interest, Western Mass. That's okay. It's really intriguing to me. I have an article coming out about that will, in a certain sense, get to the Central America movement, but it's looking at this goes back to your question in a way about Vietnam. The entire period that I was active here, 82 into like 95, maybe not quite 95, but through the end of the Cold War, if you want, we were, we could, we took for granted that there was a solid bloc in Congress who basically agreed with us, which is not true now. That's why, Edward Boland, who was nobody's idea of a radical Massachusetts congressman, he was a straight, old-fashioned Irish Democrat. He put in the motion to block all aid to the Contras. That was really big deal. And then Joe Moakley, who was a really good, but an Irish Democrat from South Boston. I mean, Mr. Moakley, I mean, God knows, I mean, how many lives were saved because of his work to guarantee, temporary protected status. And who worked for Joe Moakley then? Jim McGovern. Now, Jim McGovern from Worcester is about as good as you're going to get. He's as good as the squad. And I, have known him a bit, and when he worked for Mr. Moakley. I mean, these are fine people. So, but when I'm thinking about Western Mass, where you are right now, you know who the congressman was then? Silvio Conti, who was a Republican. And Silvio Conti was a solid, maybe not quite as solid because, he was a Republican. So if I were writing, somebody said, oh, well, I want to do a dissertation on the solidarity movement in Western Mass, I would say, look into that. Like why was that? Where did Silvio Conti come from? And also, in fact, you'd be saying, well, okay, the first thing you need to know is he's Catholic because the Catholics are really, really key to this movement. They really didn't accept Tip O'Neill, who was the most powerful Democrat in the country for a long time, another Irish Democrat, majority leader of the House. It's a famous story, actually. Tip O'Neill, who had an aunt who was a Maryknoll in Nicaragua. So she talked to him. She talked to him about what the U.S. was doing in Nicaragua. So you see what I'm saying? Like, okay, that's Massachusetts. Like, don't just look at the solidarity committees, look at this larger frame that gave them purchase on actual politics. That's what I would say to a grad student. So don't widen it out. So you're talking about all the people who are willing to listen to these are radical positions, right? I don't know. That's my take.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Yeah, so I think my next question is, so as a lifelong anti-imperialist, what advice would you give to UMass students who want to practice solidarity with movements in the global South in
Boy,
today's world?
that's a really good question. Um, well, we're living through obviously, we know we're living through strange times. Actually, there was a significant period in the recent left. I mean, it needs to be said that somewhere in the Obama years, Occupy, then Bernie, Black Lives Matter, Trayvon, the left has actually come a very long way since maybe 2011, Occupy, and then, the murder of Trayvon Martin. Um, from a very fallow time in the 90s and 2000s, I was very involved in the anti-Iraq war movement, and we had some successes, but it was very much, it was the older people, I mean, Anyway, so there's been a lot of the reason I'm saying this. So since the Obama years, there's been a great increase in the organized discipline and effectiveness of the left in the US. In fact, even though we're dealing with MAGA and Trump, these two things are connected, actually, the fact that the left, and obviously there's Bernie, I mean, and then the squad, all this stuff. But what's interesting is for quite a long time, all through the teens, this wide-ranging left actually displayed almost no interest at all in foreign policy and the rest of the world and the U.S. role in the world. Um, in 2014, another activist, well, two other key people, but people that I've been associated with for years, and we've done a lot of things together. Bill Fletcher Jr., very important Black activist, very key figure, and Phyllis Bennis, who's at IPS, Institute for Policy Studies. So we go way back. And the three of us, Bill and me, mostly with Phyllis sort of also, we wrote a position paper in 2014-15 called A New Internationalism, like, really post-Cold War, really looking at the world. It went nowhere. We published it. It was published here, we sent it like there was just like ho hum, who cares? So we're coming out of a period in which the left actually, look at us and look at if you looked at Bernie's speeches, right? There's no mention. No, I love Bernie, but I mean, the billionaire class, nothing about US foreign policy. And meanwhile, running all through everything is the Palestine exception, and which is now finally, like, we're finally confronting that. The Palestine exception has been there as long as I can, my whole life, right? This thing, you can't talk about that. People on the board of your organization or funders are going to be upset. That's over there, like sort of over there, not in, I don't mean nobody cared about it, but it was very exceptional and isolated. So obviously, so now we're in this. I mean, I literally wrote something this morning to Bill Fletcher Jr. If you could look him up, he's a pretty interesting person. Done a lot of stuff. I was head of Trans-Africa for a while, Trans-Africa was a very important organization in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, I just wrote him this morning saying maybe we should rewrite this new internationalism because now between MAGA America First, Trump, as wacko as he seems to be, Trump and the people around him are actually reviving an entire practice and policy and viewpoint of the US role in the world that predates World War II, that we thought was gone forever, which is, I don't want to use the word isolationist because it's so mystified and sort of, it's not isolationism, it's unilateralism and Western hemisphericism, okay? Greenland, Panama, right? So it's not anti-imperialist, but in a certain way, it's kind of anti-militarist and anti-interventionist, as in, why are we spending all this money to protect these other people like the Europeans? Why do we foreign aid? All of that, the entire apparatus. So you've got America first over here, and then you've got the extraordinary efflorescence of Palestine solidarity work. I mean, just amazing, under conditions of extreme repression, really, right? Like as well as I. So, wow, I don't actually know if I'm qualified to give any advice. Um, what would I? Well, let's see. Study what's worked in the past. There are certain people on the left that has arrived in the past, say, 14, 15 years, who have been known to say things. I could name them in Jacobin specifically, who have literally referred to, sort of since from 1970 through Bernie, there wasn't any left. They've said things like this, which is objectively racist to begin with. Like they actually seem to have never heard of the Rainbow Coalition. And if I look pissed off, it's because I am, because a lot of arrogance, and these are young white people who say these things. No, don't take it ill. I've been but I mean, literally, no. I mean, if I were like, want to engage in anti-imperialism and solidarity work, study what has been successful, the best lessons from the Vietnam War movement, from the Central America movement, from the anti-apartheid movement. There's a lot to look at, right? Actually, because of some things I was writing, I've been reading a lot about the not just anti-apartheid, it's much more the sort of Africa solidarity, if you want to call it. And some of that, a lot of that is it's really impressive stuff. The American Committee on Africa, really impressive group going back to the 50s. So study that. Okay, that would be my first advice. Like, go find, I wish there were Central America solidarity. There's now more than just me, frankly. It used to be there was not much more than me, but there's books, there's stuff you can read. Anti-apartheid, Africa solidarity, the Vietnam movement. So there's that. The only other thing I would say is, to me, Jewish Voice for Peace is and the associated groups with it are extremely impressive. I'm a sort of I'm a bystander activist. Well, because my group, Historians for Peace and Democracy, and Kevin is on the steering committee, is very active, and Chris is a close ally, and so on. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, we do a lot of stuff that isn't just Palestine solidarity, but it's our main thing now, and it's a big thing within our profession. So, um, I mean, JVP, if not now, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. I mean, the question is, I mean, I'm not Jewish, so can you? I don't know. Can you? I mean, when I say what's impressive about JVP to me is that, like CISPES and some of the other Central American organizations, not just us, the Pledge of Resistance, you know, they have a real grassroots. They're real, you know, they've got chapters. They function democratically. They're about to have this huge national meeting in Baltimore. I've thought of going because I'm Jewish adjacent, as I would say. Anyway, those are, well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like what the only other thing I'm going to say is sort of a standard thing you will hear from older activist types, which is really resist the siren song of, for lack of a better word, dogmatism. It's really easy, and frankly, it does seem easier in the past some years in this millennium. It's really easy to posture with what I would have called ultra left, or Lenin would have called infantile left positions. Avoid that, actually. It isn't really helpful. It's uh Maurice Mitchell, a national director of the Working Families Party, wrote a really important piece. Maybe you've heard about this. It was in The Forge and in Convergence. Convergence is the magazine that I work with, sort of, I mean, I would say this more kind of not quasi off the record, not Jacobin, because I read Jacobin, but I don't like the politics. So anyway, yeah, I mean, so Maurice, I don't really know him personally, but the thing he wrote it was more than a year ago. It was like around November of 23. I can find it and send it to you if you want. It's very important. He talks about the internal dynamics of left organizations, the tendency towards finger pointing and denouncing, and also focusing very much on yourself and your own, to put it bluntly, feelings. So I'll say this, and I just retired as a professor, right? And I'm just going to put it plainly. Feelings are not politics. And that applies to all of us, not just privileged white men like me, right? That's clearly true, but that really applies to everybody. you know, um, Politics is other directed. Politics is we are together seeking to achieve this thing. That's the focus of not, anyway, that's just some, thoughts. Avoid posturing, avoid self-serving behavior. Try really hard to, preserve your organizations, preserve unity. I don't know. That's how it seems to me.
I think that's really good advice. Yeah, the importance of like discipline and coalitional organizing is something, yeah, we really wanted to highlight in our exhibition.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, when I came into this, I've been active in all kinds of like Vietnam War and then electoral stuff in the 70s, and then I stopped doing anything in the late 70s. It was the Carter years. I mean, I have no good excuse. I just was not active for about 4 or 5 years. But at least back then, I mean, if someone started attacking other people in an organization, like denouncing them for being insufficiently radical or saying something, that actually back then would have made people quite wary. because that is classic agent provocateur behavior. It's something the FBI had perfected, all of COINTELPRO. I actually have found versions of this, the anonymous letters. Many of us think that I mean, this, and there's actually certain points. I'm sorry, I'm elaborating this, where, the distinction between an agent provocateur and just a dangerous sectarian asshole is a little hard to tell, you know, right? Because the effect is the same, you know? I mean it. So, like if that stuff starts happening, and I'm obviously outside the encampments, I read about them and I am enormously supportive. But sometimes you hear about this sort of, destructive, though mostly they seem like they've been extremely disciplined and serious and thoughtful. I mean, impressive. Anyway, that was just, for what it's worth.
No, I think that's really useful. I think, especially for a lot of young activists who have like interest in getting involved, like these are things that like it's so important to have these conversations with people who've been involved in organizing for so much longer.
Yeah,
Who've
I
like
mean,
seen
also,
these.
and you want a welcoming environment. You want people to come in and not worry that if they're going to say the wrong thing. You're never going to hear the word woke out of me. That's just bullshit. Oh, I mean, attacking people, attacking the youth for being woke. That's just right-wing crap. It used to be politically correct, but one should. And I was quite aware of this in CISPES. There were times when there was behavior. It wasn't ultra left posturing. It was just kind of like it's very easy to just naturally fall into something that where someone new to a group doesn't feel welcome because everybody already knows the terms of things, and you want to be open so that people can join who may not have and not feel they're going to be attacked for saying the wrong thing. Okay, so these are good questions.
Yeah, I think we've kind of answered every sort of question
Okay,
I've had. If
good.
we want to,
Okay. No, I don't. I mean, those are really good questions. Uh, other than the extraordinary, I mean, the repression that the Palestine movement is facing now is beyond anything. It, in comparison, university presidents were lining up to get arrested at the South African embassy in 84 and 85. um, the only time I ever had, I mean, I've been very active, I mean, not an armchair radical, right? The only time I ever had any negative and, was because of Palestine. I was up for a job because I wanted to live in New York and not have to commute. And I was up for a job at a New York university, even though I was already tenured and so on. And between the time when I arrived, I was on campus. I was one of two on campus people, like almost the job was there. And between the time when I arrived on campus at this university in New York and the middle of the day, it all went south because somebody went and read one of my HuffPost blogs where I referred to Israel as an apartheid state. That's the only time, and this is not remotely like what's happening now. People are having their degrees revoked, being kicked out of dorms, ISIS being left in. No university president should cooperate with ICE. That's completely unacceptable. And yet, look what's happening. So, I mean, this movement now, I mean, the Palestine movement, but it's going to spread out beyond that. That this is just the beginning. I mean, these are hard times. So I feel actually like I don't have uh, I'm kind of like, I'm glad I'm retired, in a way. Yeah. Anyway, okay, good. Well, thanks for giving me the chance to talk about all this. If you
yeah, no,
think of anything else, yeah, let me know.
great. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with
Okay.
you, and I'd
Nice
love
to
to
meet
talk more.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Tell me, why don't you send me an email or right now? I mean, are you were doing an MA? Do I have that correct?
Yeah, I'm a master's student. So I'm actually finishing up. I'm trying to actually not go down the academic path. I want to be like a high school history teacher now. So
Okay.
kind of transition.
Nice. Are you doing a thesis, I assume?
Uh, no, I'm more on the like public history track. So doing like
Oh,
shorter
okay.
essays
Okay.
and
Oh, all right.
exhibitions, things like that.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Well, it's nice to meet you. Good luck up there. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. You really appreciate it. And you're
Yeah.
always welcome if you want to yeah, visit our exhibition. It'll be on display all of April.
Yeah, no, I'll think about it. I'm going to Ireland for 2 weeks in April, which is going to be wonderful. I've spent a lot of time in Ireland. It's going to be great to be in a country that has never invaded or occupied anywhere else, you know? And also in Ireland, there's hardly any political space in Ireland where they're not pro-Palestine. Imagine. I mean, it's really something. So anyway, so I probably won't get a chance, but I'm glad. Is the exhibit online? Can I look at some of it online?
Yeah, yeah. I can send you the website
Oh,
afterwards.
that's great.
And then
Okay.
that's also where the interview will live
Okay.
as well.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.
Sure. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.